It was just a portrait of a mother and daughter, but it holds a secret that shocked historians. The antique market on Milwaukee Avenue smelled of old paper and dust, the kind of scent that clung to forgotten things. Daniel Foster had spent 15 years as a historical researcher, and he knew that smell meant possibility. On a gray Saturday morning in March 2024, he wandered through the cramped aisles of Henderson's Antiques, his trained eyes scanning shelves packed with Depression-era glassware, Victorian jewelry, and stacks of photographs that no living person could identify anymore. He almost walked past the wooden crate. It sat beneath a table loaded with tarnished silverware, partially hidden by a moth-eaten quilt. The handwritten sign taped to its side read, "Photolot, $40. Daniel crouched down, his knees protesting, and lifted the lid. Inside lay dozens of photographs, cartes de visite, and tintypes jumbled together without organization or care. Most showed stern-faced strangers from the late 1800s, their names and stories lost to time. Then his fingers touched something different. The daguerreotype was heavier than the paper photographs surrounding it, its image captured on a silvered copper plate and sealed behind glass in a leather case. Daniel's breath caught as he opened it carefully. Unlike the deteriorated images around it, this one had been protected, preserved. Two women stared back at him from 1862, frozen in a moment that had occurred over 160 years ago. The composition was formal, typical of the era. A white woman in her early 40s sat in an ornate chair, her dark silk dress buttoning high at the throat. Her hair was parted severely in the middle and pulled back, and a distinctive cameo brooch adorned her collar. Her expression was serious but not unkind, her eyes looking directly at the camera with quiet confidence. Beside her stood a younger woman, perhaps 19 or 20, and Daniel found himself staring at her. She was fair-skinned and strikingly beautiful, a beauty that seemed to transcend the limitations of the old photographic technology. Her features were delicate and symmetrical, her cheekbones high, her eyes large and luminous, even in the monochrome image. Her hair cascaded smoothly over her shoulders in long, unnaturally soft cascades, carefully arranged for the photograph. She wore a dress of lighter fabric, well-made and elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs. But something about her posture made Daniel pause. The white woman sat comfortably, naturally, her hands folded in her lap, with the ease of someone accustomed to being photographed. The younger woman stood beside the chair, one hand resting lightly on its back, but her shoulders carried a tension that the formal pose couldn't quite hide. Her fingers, visible where they touched the chair, showed a different story than her elegant dress suggested. Even in the daguerreotype's soft focus, Daniel could see the texture of hands that had known hard work. He turned the case over. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Mrs. Sarah and Catherine, Millard Studio, Chicago, March 14th, 1862. March 1862. The Civil War had been raging for nearly a year. Daniel's pulse quickened as he stared at the inscription. He had studied enough 19th century photography to know that having a daguerreotype made was expensive, a luxury reserved for the wealthy. The clothing both women wore confirmed status and means. Everything about the image suggested a respectable family portrait, the kind that thousands of American families commissioned during that era to preserve their likenesses for future generations. Yet something felt profoundly wrong. The relationship between the two women seemed simultaneously intimate and distant. They were positioned close together as a mother and daughter would be, but there was no physical contact beyond the younger woman's hand on the chair. Their expressions, while both serious in the Victorian manner, carried different qualities. Mrs. Sarah looked directly at the camera with assurance. Catherine's gaze was equally direct, but there was something guarded in it, something watchful that made Daniel's researcher instincts flare. And those hands. Daniel couldn't stop looking at Catherine's hands. He had examined thousands of historical photographs, had learned to read the small details that revealed truths about people's lives. Wealthy young women in 1862 would have had soft hands, protected by gloves and freed from manual labor. Catherine's hands, even in this formal portrait, showed signs of work that no amount of fine clothing could erase. The knuckles were slightly enlarged, the fingers bore what looked like old scars, and the way she held them suggested someone more accustomed to physical labor than leisurely pursuits. Daniel checked the price tag again, $40 for the entire crate. The daguerreotype alone was worth 10 times that to the right collector, and he had a feeling it might be worth far more to history. "I'll take the whole lot," he told Mr. Henderson, pulling out his wallet before the old man could reconsider his pricing. 20 minutes later, Daniel sat in his car with the leather case open on his lap, studying the image in the better light from his window. He pulled out his phone and took several high-resolution photographs, zooming in on details. The cameo brooch Mrs. Sarah wore had a distinctive pattern he wanted to examine more closely. The style of Catherine's dress, the way her unusually straight hair had been arranged, the positioning of her body, all of it would require closer analysis. But it was the date that kept drawing his attention. March 14th, 1862. Chicago, the middle of the Civil War, in a city that was known as a crucial hub for the Underground Railroad. Daniel had spent the last 5 years researching abolitionist networks in the Midwest. He knew the history of Chicago's role in helping enslaved people escape to freedom, knew the names of the prominent Quaker families who had risked everything to operate safe houses and provide passage north. He knew that by 1862, the system was operating with increasing boldness as the war dragged on, and the question of slavery moved toward its ultimate resolution. He looked again at Catherine's beautiful face, at the elegant dress that seemed borrowed somehow, at the tension in her shoulders that the photographer had captured despite the long exposure time required for daguerreotypes. The Chicago History Museum's Research Center occupied a quiet corner of the building, far from the public galleries where tourists examined dioramas of the Great Fire and displays of the city's industrial heritage. Daniel had been coming here for years, and the archivists knew him well enough to wave him through security without questions about the leather case he carried under his arm. Maria Gonzalez looked up from her computer when he entered the research room. She had worked at the museum for 23 years, and her knowledge of Chicago's photographic history was encyclopedic. Her dark eyes registered curiosity when she saw Daniel's expression. "I found something," he said without preamble, setting the daguerreotype case on her desk with the care of someone handling an unexploded bomb. "I need everything you have on the Millard studio, and I need it yesterday." Maria raised an eyebrow but opened the case. Her expression shifted immediately from curiosity to focused attention. She studied the image in silence for a long moment, her fingers hovering just above the glass without touching it. Then she turned it over to read the inscription on the back. When she looked up at Daniel, her eyes were sharp with understanding. "Where did you find this? Antique market, mixed in with a crate of worthless tintypes?" He pulled up a chair, unable to contain his excitement. "Tell me you have records on Millard." "The Millard studio." Maria's fingers were already flying across her keyboard with practiced speed. "Edmund Millard. He operated on Clark Street from 1859 to 1867. The studio was destroyed in the Great Fire, but some of his business records survived because he'd stored them in a bank vault downtown." She paused, reading something on her screen, and her expression grew more interested. "This is fascinating. He was a documented abolitionist. There are records of him attending anti-slavery meetings at the First Presbyterian Church. He also testified in a fugitive slave case in 1860. Daniel's pulse quickened. "What else do you have?" "Give me a minute." Maria disappeared into the archive stacks, leaving Daniel alone with the daguerreotype. He opened the case again, studying Catherine's face in the fluorescent light. There was intelligence in her eyes, a quality that the camera had captured despite the technological limitations of the medium. She had known she was being photographed, had understood the importance of the moment. The way she held herself, despite the visible tension, spoke of dignity and strength that couldn't be suppressed, even in circumstances that must have been terrifying. The question was, why? Why would an abolitionist photographer take such a formal, expensive portrait of a white woman and a young black woman posed as family? What purpose could it possibly serve in the middle of a war? Maria returned, carrying a gray archive box and 2 pairs of white cotton gloves. "Millard Studio Business Ledger, 1860 to 1865, she announced, setting it down with the reverence it deserved. "We've had it digitized, but I thought you'd want to see the original." They pulled on the gloves carefully. Maria opened the ledger with practiced care, her gloved hands treating the aged pages like sacred texts. The handwriting inside was neat and methodical, recording dates, names, types of photographs commissioned, and prices paid. Each entry told a small story of Chicago life in the 1860s. Families preserving their likenesses, young soldiers getting portraits made before heading to war, memorial images of deceased children that broke Daniel's heart every time he encountered them in historical records. "March 1862, Daniel murmured, and Maria began turning pages slowly, her eyes scanning each entry with professional precision. The entries for that month showed the typical business of a portrait studio. Family photographs at $3 each, individual portraits at $2, several carte de visite orders, which were cheaper and increasingly popular. Then Maria's finger stopped on a line halfway down the page for March 14th, and Daniel leaned forward so quickly he nearly bumped heads with her. "Mrs. S. Dawson, 1 daguerreotype, full plate, 2 subjects. Rush order, payment in full, cash, $15. $15. Daniel whistled softly through his teeth. "That's expensive. Most daguerreotypes in this period were going for $3 to $5, and by 1862 they were already going out of fashion. "Rush order, though," Maria pointed out, tapping the notation gently. "And full plate. That's the largest size, the most expensive format. This wasn't a casual commission." She looked at the daguerreotype again, comparing it to the ledger entry with a historian's eye for detail. "Mrs. S. Dawson, not Sarah. Do you think the inscription on the back is wrong?" "Or deliberately misleading," Daniel said, his mind racing through possibilities. "Using just a first name and Catherine, with no last name at all? That's odd for a formal commission like this. Can you search for Sarah Dawson in the Chicago City Directory for 1862? While Maria worked her digital magic, pulling up databases that Daniel had standing access to, but that she could navigate faster, he continued reading through the ledger. The entries around March 14th showed no other rush orders that month, no other daguerreotypes at all. Millard was primarily doing carte de visite by 1862, cheaper, more popular, easier to produce in multiple copies. A daguerreotype was already somewhat old-fashioned by then, though still preferred by some wealthy clients for its superior quality and durability. So why would someone pay premium price for an outdated, expensive format? Unless the point wasn't just to have a photograph, but to have a specific kind of photograph, one that was substantial, impressive, official-looking, the kind of photograph that could serve as documentation. Got it, Maria announced, pulling Daniel from his thoughts. Sarah Dawson, widow. Address listed as 347 North Franklin Street. Occupation listed as proprietor, boarding house. She pulled up a historical map of Chicago on her second screen, overlaying it with the modern street grid. That address would have been in a respectable neighborhood at the time, but not wealthy, solidly middle class at best. A boarding house owner, Daniel said slowly, the implications crystallizing in his mind. That's very interesting. Why? Because boarding houses were perfect cover for underground railroad activity. Daniel stood and began pacing Maria's small office, his mind working through the historical puzzle with increasing excitement. Think about it. Boarding houses had people coming and going constantly. You could let rooms temporarily, no questions asked about travelers passing through. Different faces every week wouldn't raise suspicion. That was literally the business model. And Franklin Street, he tried to visualize the historical geography of the city, overlaying his knowledge of 1860s Chicago onto the modern streets he knew. That was close to the train stations, wasn't it? Very close, Maria confirmed, zooming in on her historical map. The Illinois Central Railroad terminus was just a few blocks away. You could walk it in 10 minutes, maybe less. And look, she traced a route with her finger on the screen. From the train station to Franklin Street, you'd pass right by the Millard studio on Clark Street. It's almost a direct line. The geography was damning in its convenience. Daniel could picture it now. A scared young woman arriving at the train station, maybe having traveled hidden in a freight car or disguised as a servant to someone sympathetic to the cause. She's met by an operative, perhaps Sarah Dawson herself, and taken the short walk to a boarding house where she can rest, eat, change into borrowed clothes that don't mark her as a fugitive. Then, before she continues north, they take her to Millard's studio. They create documentation. They create proof of identity that might save her life if she's questioned. What happened to Millard after the war? Daniel asked, still pacing. Maria scrolled through her notes, pulling up biographical information. He kept operating until the Great Fire in 1871. After that, he moved to Philadelphia, probably because his studio and most of his equipment were destroyed. There's a notation here that he donated some of his surviving photographic equipment to the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865, helping formerly enslaved people get identification photographs made. She paused, reading further. He died in 1889, never married, no children. But there's a reference to him in a book about Chicago abolitionists published in 1923. Apparently, he was quite open about his activities after the war ended, and it was safe to talk about such things. So he was definitely part of the network, Daniel said, feeling the satisfaction of confirmation, using photography as a tool for liberation. Not just documenting the world, but actively shaping it, creating evidence, creating identities that could mean the difference between freedom and recapture. You think this portrait was fake? Maria gestured at the daguerreotype, her voice dropping slightly as if the women in the image might somehow overhear. That they weren't really mother and daughter? I think this portrait served a purpose beyond preserving a family memory. Daniel stopped pacing and leaned against the desk, his eyes on Catherine's face. March 1862. The war is in full swing, but the Underground Railroad is still operating, maybe even more desperately than before. Enslaved people know this might be their last chance before things get much worse, or before the system collapses entirely, depending on how the war goes. But the journey north is incredibly dangerous. There are still federal marshals enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, even in free states. Bounty hunters, slave catchers, Southern sympathizers who'd turn you in for the reward money. Maria was nodding slowly, following his reasoning with the keen understanding of someone who'd spent decades studying how ordinary people navigated extraordinary circumstances. So you need documentation, papers that say you're free, that you belong somewhere, that you're traveling legitimately and not running away. Exactly, Daniel said, feeling the rightness of the theory settle into certainty. And what better documentation than a daguerreotype showing you as the daughter of a respectable white woman? It's expensive, yes, which actually works in your favor. It signals wealth and status. It's official looking, impressive, sealed in a leather case. And most importantly, it's visual proof that you belong with this white woman who claims you as family. He picked up the leather case again, looking at the image with new understanding and profound admiration. Catherine, if that was even her real name, could travel with this portrait. If questioned by authorities or suspicious citizens, she could show it. This is my mother, Mrs. Sarah Dawson. I'm traveling to meet her in Canada, or Wisconsin, or wherever they were actually sending her. The photograph becomes her protection, her shield. Who's going to question a well-dressed young woman with expensive photographic documentation of her family connection? But the risk, Maria breathed, her eyes wide. If they were caught, if anyone discovered what they were really doing, Millard could be prosecuted under the Fugitive Slave Act. Mrs. Dawson, too. They could be fined thousands of dollars, imprisoned, their lives destroyed. They knew that, Daniel said quietly, and they did it anyway. They looked at the risk and decided that another person's freedom was worth it. He felt a surge of admiration for people he'd never met, dead for over a century, who had had the courage to break laws they considered unjust. The question is, how many times did they do it? How many other daguerreotypes like this are sitting in attics and antique shops and museum storage rooms, their real purpose forgotten or never recorded in the first place? Maria was quiet for a moment, studying the image of the two women with fresh eyes. She's beautiful, she finally said, looking at Catherine with something like sorrow. Extraordinarily so. That would have helped, wouldn't it? Made her less suspicious in some people's eyes. Made the story of her being this white woman's daughter more believable if she could pass for mixed race in certain lights. Daniel nodded slowly, thinking about the complicated calculations of appearance and survival that Black Americans had been forced to make for centuries. And more vulnerable in other ways, beauty could attract the wrong kind of attention, make her more memorable to people who might later report seeing her. It was both an asset and a liability. He studied Catherine's straight hair, so carefully arranged in the photograph, and wondered if that too had been part of the disguise, part of making her appearance fit the story they were trying to tell. So what's your next step? Maria asked, always practical. I need to find out who Catherine really was, and whether she made it. Daniel's apartment in Hyde Park had long ago been converted into a workspace that would have horrified any interior designer. Bookcases lined every wall, stuffed with historical texts and archival boxes. His desk dominated the living room, supporting two large computer monitors and teetering stacks of printouts and photocopied documents. He'd pinned the high-resolution prints of the daguerreotype to a corkboard above his workspace, where Catherine and Sarah stared down at him as he worked into the early morning hours. For 5 days straight, he'd done nothing but research. The coffee maker ran constantly, producing fuel for marathon research sessions. Takeout containers accumulated on the kitchen counter and archaeological layers marking the passage of time. His sleep schedule had collapsed into sporadic naps between deep dives into digital archives, obscure historical databases, and emails to archivists across the Midwest. But he was making progress, pulling threads from different sources that were starting to weave together into something coherent and remarkable. Sarah Dawson had been harder to trace than he'd expected. The 1860 census listed her at the Franklin Street address, a widow aged 41, head of household with 4 boarders whose names meant nothing to Daniel's research so far. No children of her own were listed, which made sense if she was using the mother and daughter fiction for Underground Railroad purposes. The 1850 census showed her married to a Thomas Dawson, merchant, but he had died in 1857 according to death records, leaving Sarah to run the boarding house alone. But it was the death records that had given him his first real breakthrough into her identity. Sarah Dawson died in 1889 at age 70 in Evanston, Illinois. Her death certificate listed her maiden name, Sarah Blackburn. And Blackburn was a name that appeared repeatedly, insistently throughout Daniel's files on Chicago abolitionist activity. The Blackburn family had been prominent Quakers, members of the Society of Friends, deeply committed to the anti-slavery cause with the fervor that characterized that religious community. When Daniel cross-referenced the name with church records from the Chicago Friends Meeting House, he found Sarah Blackburn Dawson listed as an active member from 1858 until her death. The records showed she'd attended weekly meetings faithfully, contributed regularly to the church's aid fund for the poor, and served on a committee with the innocuous-sounding name Charitable Assistance to Travelers. The coded language made Daniel's skin prickle with recognition. He was reading through digitized Quaker meeting minutes from 1862, his eyes burning from hours of screen time, when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Maria Gonzalez, and he answered immediately, grateful for the interruption. "Tell me you're eating actual food and not just living on coffee," she said, without preamble, her voice carrying the warm concern of a friend who'd seen too many researchers destroy their health in pursuit of historical truths. "I had a sandwich yesterday, I think." Daniel rubbed his eyes, trying to remember. Maybe it was the day before. "What's up?" "I found something, and I think you're going to want to sit down for this." Daniel was already sitting, but he straightened in his chair, suddenly alert, despite the exhaustion that had been weighing on him moments before. "I'm listening." "I was going through our collection of abolitionist papers," Maria said, and he could hear the excitement barely controlled in her voice. And there's a letter from Edmund Millard to a Reverend Calvin Fletcher in Indianapolis, dated April 1862, just a month after your daguerreotype was made. Want to hear it? Absolutely. Read it. Maria's voice shifted into her formal reading tone, the one she used when presenting historical documents. Dear Calvin, the package you requested has been prepared and will be sent by express as discussed. The quality is excellent despite the rush, and I believe it will serve its intended purpose admirably. The subject was most cooperative and understood the gravity of the situation. I pray that all goes well with the remaining arrangements and that our mutual friend arrives safely at her destination. Your friend in the light, Edmund Millard. Daniel's heart was pounding. The light? That's Quaker terminology, isn't it? Exactly. Friends refer to the inner light, the divine spark in every person. It's distinctively Quaker phrasing. Maria paused for effect. And Calvin Fletcher was a known Underground Railroad conductor in Indianapolis. There's extensive documentation of his activities helping freedom seekers reach Canada through the Detroit route. He kept detailed records, Daniel. Incredibly detailed, and many of them survived. So Millard was using coded language to tell Fletcher that a photograph had been made for someone they were helping escape. Daniel stood and began pacing his small apartment, phone pressed to his ear, his mind racing through the implications. The package was the daguerreotype. The subject was Catherine. And our mutual friend, arriving at her destination, that means Fletcher was expecting her, was part of the network getting her to Canada. That's my interpretation too, Maria confirmed. And here's where it gets really interesting. I found a reference to Fletcher in a collection at the Indiana Historical Society. He kept coded journals of his Underground Railroad activities, using names and dates and routes. After his death, his family donated them to the Historical Society. They've been decoded by historians over the years. If Catherine passed through his network in 1862, there might be documentation of it. There might be a record of her real name. Daniel stopped pacing, his hand tightening on the phone. Can you get access to those records? Already requested them. They're sending digital copies. Should arrive in my email within 48 hours. Maria paused, and her voice softened. How are you doing? You sound exhausted. I'm fine. This is too important to stop now. It's important that you don't burn yourself out, too, Maria said gently. The story has waited over 160 years. It can wait another day or two while you get some sleep and a decent meal. She was right, of course, but Daniel felt the familiar researcher's obsession gripping him, the need to know, to understand, to bring hidden truth into light. 2 days later, Daniel sat in Maria's office at the Chicago History Museum, both of them hunched over her computer screen as they read through the decoded entries from Calvin Fletcher's journal. The Indiana Historical Society had sent over 200 pages of scanned documents, and they'd been reading for 3 hours straight, searching for any mention of someone matching Catherine's description traveling through Indianapolis in the spring of 1862. Then they found her. April 3rd, 1862, Maria read aloud, her finger tracing the line on the screen. Received tonight a young woman of perhaps 19 or 20 years, traveling under the name C. Dawson with documentation from our friends in Chicago. She carries a daguerreotype of excellent quality showing her with her supposed mother. The resemblance is of course manufactured, but the photograph itself is convincing enough to satisfy any casual inspection. She reports her true name as Catherine Williams, recently escaped from a plantation in Kentucky. She is of remarkable appearance and composed bearing despite her ordeal. I have arranged for her to continue north with the morning train, accompanied by friend Harrison, who will see her safely to Detroit. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Catherine Williams. She had a name now, a real name, not just the alias on a daguerreotype. Keep reading. Is there more? Maria scrolled down, scanning entries. April 5th. Received word from friend Harrison that C.W. arrived safely in Detroit and has been placed with the Baptist congregation there, who will arrange her passage across to Windsor. She expressed profound gratitude for the assistance rendered, and particular thanks for the photographic documentation, which twice served to deflect suspicious inquiry during her journey. Twice, Daniel said softly. The photograph saved her twice. It worked exactly as they intended. There's more, Maria said, her voice thick with feeling. May 1862. Received letter from our associates in Canada. C.W. has arrived safely and is in good health. She has found employment with a family in Windsor and sends her thanks to all who aided her passage to freedom. She particularly wishes that the woman in Chicago who stood with her for the photograph should know that she thinks of her often, and will never forget the kindness shown to a stranger. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they'd discovered settling over them. Catherine Williams had made it. She had escaped slavery, survived the dangerous journey north using the daguerreotype as her shield, and reached freedom in Canada. The photograph that Daniel had found in a $40 crate of forgotten images had been part of a successful rescue, a small but crucial piece of the vast machinery of the Underground Railroad. We need to find out what happened to her after that, Daniel said finally. Did she stay in Windsor? Did she marry, have children? There could be descendants who have no idea their ancestor was once enslaved, who escaped with the help of Chicago abolitionists and a fake photograph. Maria was already searching. Canadian census records. Give me a minute. While she worked, Daniel looked again at the high-resolution image of the daguerreotype on Maria's secondary monitor. Daniel stood in the exhibition hall of the Chicago History Museum 6 months later, watching visitors examine the daguerreotype that had consumed his life for half a year. It was now the centerpiece of a new exhibition called Captured Freedom, Photography and the Underground Railroad, mounted in a climate-controlled case with dramatic lighting that highlighted every detail of the image. Next to it, the museum had displayed the research he and Maria had compiled: the letter from Millard to Fletcher, excerpts from Fletcher's journal, census records showing Catherine Williams living in Windsor, Ontario in 1870 and 1880, married to a carpenter named James Patterson and mother of 4 children. The exhibition also featured 3 other daguerreotypes they'd discovered during their research, all from Millard's studio, all showing similar compositions of white women with black women or children, all used as documentation for freedom seekers escaping north. The pattern, once recognized, had been unmistakable. Edmund Millard had created perhaps dozens of these false family portraits, each one a small act of resistance against the institution of slavery. A young black woman stood in front of Catherine's portrait now, reading the interpretive text that explained the photograph's true purpose. Daniel watched as her expression shifted from curiosity to understanding to something like awe. She pulled out her phone and took a photograph of the daguerreotype, perhaps to share with family, perhaps to keep as a reminder of what people had risked for freedom. "She has descendants, you know," Maria said, appearing at Daniel's elbow with 2 cups of coffee. "Catherine Williams. We found them through genealogical records. 3 great-great-grandchildren still living in Ontario. One of them is driving down for the exhibition opening next week." "Did you tell them the whole story?" Daniel asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Everything we found. They knew their ancestor had been born enslaved and escaped to Canada, but they didn't know the details of how she got there. They definitely didn't know about the photograph." Maria smiled. "The oldest granddaughter cried when I sent her the image. She said Catherine looked just like her own daughter. Same eyes, same expression. The resemblance was striking even across 6 generations." Daniel thought about that, about how Catherine's courage and determination had echoed down through the decades, creating lives that would never have existed if she hadn't made that terrifying journey north. 4 children, who had children of their own, spreading out across Canada and back into the United States after it was safe to return. A whole family tree grown from one woman's desperate bid for freedom and the people who helped her achieve it. "Sarah Dawson doesn't have any descendants," he said quietly. "She never had children of her own, but in a way, everyone who survived because of her help, they're her legacy too." "I've been thinking about that," Maria said, "about how many people might have passed through her boarding house, how many photographs Millard made, how many lives were changed by what they did. We'll never know the full count. Most of the records were destroyed or never existed in the first place because it was too dangerous to write things down. But we know about Catherine," Daniel said. "We can tell her story, and through her story, we can honor all the others whose names we'll never know." The museum was starting to fill with visitors for the evening reception. Daniel recognized several academic colleagues, local historians, members of the African American Genealogical Society who'd helped with the research. The story had generated significant media attention, articles in history journals, a feature in the Tribune, interest from documentary filmmakers. But for Daniel, the most meaningful moment was watching ordinary museum visitors stop in front of the daguerreotype and realize what they were seeing: not just a photograph, but evidence of extraordinary courage and compassion captured in silver and light. A white-haired man approached the display, squinting at the text through his glasses. Daniel watched him read, saw the moment of recognition as he understood what the photograph represented. The man stood there for a long time, studying Catherine's face, perhaps wondering what she had been thinking in that moment when Millard's camera captured her image. Had she been terrified? Hopeful? Had she believed the plan would work, or had she been certain she'd be caught and returned to slavery? Daniel would never know what Catherine had been feeling, but he knew what she had done. She had been brave enough to trust strangers with her life, to believe that a photograph and the goodwill of abolitionists she'd never met would be enough to carry her to freedom. And she had been right. "Thank you for this," a voice said beside him. Daniel turned to see a black woman in her 50s, her eyes bright with emotion. "My ancestor came north through the Underground Railroad, too, in 1863. We don't have much documentation, just family stories that were passed down. But seeing this, knowing that there were people who helped, who created these elaborate plans and took these risks, it makes it real in a way that stories alone can't. That's why we do this work," Daniel said, meaning it deeply, "to make the past real, to honor the people who came before us." The woman nodded and moved on to study the other daguerreotypes, and Daniel felt the familiar satisfaction of research that mattered, of bringing hidden stories into the light where they belonged. Catherine Williams had been invisible to history for over a century and a half, her story hidden in a daguerreotype that thousands of people might have looked at without understanding what they were seeing. But now she was visible again. Now her courage and Sarah Dawson's compassion and Edmund Millard's quiet resistance were part of the historical record, preserved not just in archives, but in the hearts of people who learned what they had done. Maria touched his arm gently. "Come on. You should mingle. Talk to people about the research. This is your night." "Our night," Daniel corrected, but he followed her into the crowd. The daguerreotype remained in its case, lit dramatically, Catherine's beautiful face gazing out at a world she had never imagined, a future she had helped create simply by having the courage to reach for freedom when it was offered. Her hands, scarred by labor and rough with work, rested on the back of that chair in Millard's studio. And Daniel knew that every time someone looked at those hands now, they would understand what they represented: strength, survival, and the unbreakable human desire for liberty. The photograph had kept its secret for 162 years, but secrets, Daniel had learned, are meant to be discovered. And some stories are too important to remain hidden forever.